She was 21 years old, and she had, that morning, exactly 4 sovereigns, a threadbare traveling cloak, and a small tin box that had once belonged to her grandmother. She had no family left to speak of and no roof of her own, and when the auctioneer's hammer came down at Mill Wharf that gray October afternoon, Helen Tanner became the lawful owner of a rotting timber warehouse that the whole parish agreed was worth less than the mud beneath it. What none of them knew, not the traders who laughed into their sleeves, not the solicitor's clerk who noted her name with a smirk, was that folded into the damp account chests inside that warehouse were papers that would, within a single turn of the tide, hand her the entire riverside landing. Stay close and settle in beside the fire with us, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, because this is a story worth hearing slowly from the beginning. Helen Tanner had been born in the spring of 1849 in a small stone cottage on the outskirts of the parish of Mill Wharf, the only surviving child of Thomas Tanner, a barge master who worked the slow brown river between the wharves and the inland canals, and of Margaret Tanner, née Brill, a curate's daughter who could read Latin and mend a linen shirt with equal patience. The cottage sat above a bend in the river, and from the small back window Helen had learned, before she could properly write her own name, to recognize the flags of every barge company that passed and to name the goods stacked on their decks: timber from the upper woods, slate from the northern quarries, wool bales, sacked grain, iron pigs, tallow, salt. Her father had taught her these things not as lessons but as company, speaking to her over his pipe in the long evenings after supper, and by the time she was 10 she could keep his tally book more neatly than he could himself, and she could read a bill of lading and know at a glance whether the sums added true. He had died in the winter of her 14th year, taken suddenly by a fever caught on the water, and her mother had followed him within 18 months, worn thin by grief and by the small unpaid debts he had left behind. The cottage was sold to settle what was owed, and Helen, at 16, had gone into service 2 miles up the river at the house of a Mrs. Honora Redwing, a widow of 68, who kept a narrow, immaculate household on the strength of a small annuity and a great deal of stubbornness. It was Mrs. Redwing who became the shaping hand of Helen's second life. She was a woman of few words and steady habits, and she had once, long ago, kept the books for her late husband's chandlery on the coast, and she recognized in the quiet, watchful girl who came to her door a mind that would take instruction and keep it. Over 5 years, Mrs. Redwing taught Helen to keep a double-entry ledger in a clean copperplate hand, to read a lease and mark the clauses that mattered, to reckon interest and drayage and warehousing fees, to draft a plain business letter that said only what it needed to say, and to hold her tongue in rooms where speaking would gain her nothing. She taught her also to bake a plain loaf, to mend her own boots, to turn a collar, and to sit still in her own company without fretting, which Mrs. Redwing considered the greatest skill of all. When the old woman died in the August of Helen's 21st year, quietly in her chair with her spectacles still folded in her lap, she left Helen no money, for she had none to leave, but she left her the 4 small books of her own accounting from the chandlery days, tied in a black ribbon, and a note in her hand that read only, "Read a paper before you sign it, and read a place before you buy it." Helen kept the note folded in the tin box that had come down to her from her grandmother Brill, a plain japanned tin no larger than a prayer book, painted with faded roses on the lid, in which her mother had once kept her sewing thimbles, and her father, in his last months, had kept the stubs of the tickets from the barges he had captained. The tin held now those tickets, the folded note from Mrs. Redwing, a lock of her mother's hair wrapped in tissue, and a small brass river token her father had given her on her 10th birthday, stamped with the arms of the old Wharf Company and pierced for a ribbon. She carried the tin with her everywhere, in the deep inner pocket of her cloak, and when she walked out of Mrs. Redwing's house for the last time at the end of September, having washed and covered every piece of furniture and handed the keys to the solicitor who had come from town, she had the tin, her 4 sovereigns of quarterly wages saved over 5 years, her small trunk of clothes, and no clear notion of what to do next, except that she would not go into service again if she could help it, because Mrs. Redwing had told her, plainly, in the last week of her life, that a woman who could keep books and read a lease had no business emptying another woman's coal scuttle. Helen had taken a room at the sign of the Blue Heron in the village of Mill Wharf, at 4 pence a night with breakfast, and for a fortnight she had walked the towpaths and the lanes, and read every notice pinned to every parish board, looking for a small clerkship or a copying position, or a place with a shopkeeper who needed a ledger kept, and finding none, for the parish was small and its business was tightly held. It was on the 10th of October, walking past the market cross in a fine cold rain, that she saw the printed bill announcing the auction at Mill Wharf of the effects of the late Josiah Meridew, timber merchant, deceased intestate, the sale to include one warehouse of timber and slate together with such appurtenances as pertain thereto, and beneath that phrase, in smaller type that most passers-by did not trouble to read, the standing note that all sales were subject to the terms of the ancient wharf charter as held in the parish rolls. Helen read the bill twice, standing in the rain, and then a third time, and she remembered Mrs. Redwing's note in her pocket, and she thought of her father's tally books and the brass river token in her tin, and she went back to the Blue Heron and asked the landlord, quietly, where a person might, if they wished, view the parish rolls before an auction was held. The landlord of the Blue Heron was a large, slow man named Mr. Peter Hallstock, 49 years old, a former lighterman who had lost the use of 2 fingers on his left hand in an accident with a mooring chain, and had married the innkeeper's widow 8 years earlier. He looked at Helen for a long moment across the counter, wiping a pewter mug with a cloth, and told her that the parish rolls were kept in a cupboard in the vestry of St. Anne's Church, and that the vicar, the Reverend Mr. Ambrose Whitton, would let a person read them for the asking if the person came before evensong and did not disturb the pages. Helen thanked him and went out again into the rain, and she walked the quarter-mile to St. Anne's with her cloak drawn close and the tin box knocking gently against her ribs in its inner pocket. The Reverend Mr. Whitton was a thin gray man of 62 who had buried 3 curates and outlived his wife, and he received Helen in the small stone vestry without curiosity, unlocked the cupboard, set a candle on the reading desk, and left her to it, saying only that he would return in an hour to lock up. Helen sat down at the desk with her cloak still damp on her shoulders, and she opened the parish roll for Mill Wharf, a great leather-bound book with pages older than her grandmother, and she read for the full hour with the slow, careful attention that Mrs. Redwing had taught her, tracing each clause with a finger and copying, into a small notebook she kept in her sleeve, the sentences that mattered. What she found there she did not speak of to anyone. She closed the book at the sound of the vicar's step in the passage, thanked him plainly, and walked back through the darkening rain to the Blue Heron and ate her supper of bread and cold mutton without saying a word. In the morning, being the 11th of October, she rose early, put on her best plain dress, brushed her cloak dry by the tap-room fire, took her 4 sovereigns from the lining of her trunk where she had sewn them for safe-keeping, and walked down the muddy lane to the wharf where the auction was to be held at 11 o'clock beneath the awning of the old weighing house. The rain had stopped, but the sky was low and gray, and the river ran high and brown against the timber pilings, and around the weighing house the local traders were already gathered, 20 or so men in frock coats and flat caps, smoking short pipes and speaking to one another in the private half-voices of men who all knew each other's business. Helen stood a little apart under the eaves of the coal office and waited. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Mr. Nathaniel Prewitt, of the firm of Prewitt and Sons, mounted a small wooden box at 11 exactly, and read out the terms of sale in a voice pitched to carry over the water, and when he came to the phrase, subject to the terms of the ancient wharf charter as held in the parish rolls, he read it fast, as men read the fine print of things that no longer matter, and none of the traders paid it any mind. The warehouse was called at a starting price of £5, and no one bid. Mr. Prewitt lowered it to 3, and no one bid. He lowered it to 2, and a man in a green coat laughed and said the roof would fall in before Christmas. Helen stepped forward 1 pace out of the shadow of the coal office and said, quietly and clearly, £3.10. The traders turned as one and looked at her, and there was a small silence. And then the laughter began, low at first, and then broader, and the solicitor's clerk, a young man named Mr. Ralph Bickersteth, 24 years old, wrote her name in his book with an open smirk and asked her twice to spell it. Helen spelled it twice. Mr. Prewitt, who was not unkind, asked her whether she understood what she was buying, and Helen said that she did. The hammer came down at £3.10. The clerk handed her a paper to sign, and she read the paper carefully and slowly, from the first word to the last, before she signed it, and when she signed with the clean copperplate hand that Mrs. Redwing had taught her over 5 years by candlelight, and the clerk, watching her write, stopped smirking and did not begin again. She paid £3.10 in sovereigns and shillings on the wet plank counter of the weighing house, and she was given a heavy iron key on a length of tarred twine and a folded receipt stamped with the parish seal, and she put both into the inner pocket of her cloak beside the tin box, and she walked out through the crowd of laughing traders without looking to either side. And she did not answer the man in the green coat when he called out after her to ask whether she wanted a cart to carry away her fortune. The wharf lay 1/4 of a mile below the village along a rutted cart track that curved with the river, and Helen walked it alone in the middle of the afternoon with the iron key heavy in her pocket and the folded receipt pressed against her ribs, and no one to accompany her, for she had asked no one, and no one had offered. The cart track ran between a low hawthorn hedge on the landward side and a slope of coarse grass and reeds on the river side. And the river beyond the reeds was wide and slow and the color of strong tea, and gulls stood at intervals on the mooring posts and did not move as she passed. The wind came off the water in long, soft gusts that smelled of tar and coal smoke, and the faint sweetness of rotting timber, and Helen drew her cloak close and walked steadily, feeling the fatigue of the morning settle into her legs, but not into her mind. She passed the cooper's yard, where 2 men in leather aprons were setting hoops on a barrel, and looked up as she went by but did not speak, and she passed the small brick office of the wharf clerk, which was shuttered and dark, and she passed a broken cart tipped on its side in the ditch with grass grown through the spokes of its wheels. At a bend in the track she stopped and looked back at the village on its low rise, at the square tower of St. Anne's grey against the greyer sky, at the smoke from the Blue Heron's chimney trailing sideways over the wet slate roofs, and she thought, without sentiment, that she had come a long way in a fortnight from a room at 4d. a night with breakfast to a warehouse she had bought with her own name and her own hand. She walked on. The track descended and the river widened and the wharf came into view. A long stone landing, 20 yards or more, black with wet and green at the joins where moss had taken hold, with iron mooring rings set into the coping at intervals and a set of stone steps at the downstream end running down into the water. Beyond the landing stood the warehouse itself, longer than she had understood from the auction bill, perhaps 60 feet by 20, built of dark timber, weatherboarding on a low stone plinth, with a slate roof that sagged in the middle, and a great double door of studded oak facing the river, and a smaller door at the landward end where she now approached. The whole of it leaned very slightly toward the water, as though the years had been pushing it patiently in that direction, and around it the ground was strewn with the leavings of a business run down. Broken slate, split timber, a rusted winch on its side, coils of frayed rope, a stack of empty crates blackened with damp. Helen stood for a long moment at the corner of the warehouse, and took the measure of it with her eye as Mrs. Redwing had taught her to take the measure of a room before entering it, counting the windows, marking the roof line, noting where the boards had sprung and where they still held true, and then she walked around to the landward door and drew the iron key from her pocket and fitted it into the great rust-choked lock. The key turned, with effort, on the second try. The door groaned inward on hinges that had not been oiled in years, and Helen stepped across the threshold into the cold dim inside of the place that was now hers, and she stood in the dust and the damp river smell and listened to the small sound of water dripping somewhere at the far end, and she did not sit down, and she did not weep, but she set her trunk carefully on a dry board by the door, and she took out Mrs. Redwing's 4 small account books from where she had wrapped them in oiled paper at the bottom of the trunk, and she laid them on the top of an old barrel by the door, and she began, quietly, to look. The inside of the warehouse was larger than it had looked from without, and Helen stood for some minutes only turning slowly on the spot and letting her eyes come accustomed to the gray light that entered through the two small dust-caked windows high in the landward gable and through the gaps in the weatherboarding where the daylight showed through in thin bright lines like the strings of a harp. The floor was of thick pine boards laid over sleepers, worn smooth by years of hobnailed boots and rolled barrels, dark with old spillages of tar and grease, sound underfoot in the middle of the building but soft and springy near the river end where the damp had worked up through the plinth. The roof above her was framed of great oak trusses grown black with age but showing no rot at the joints she could see, and only in the sagging center had the slates slipped, leaving a long ragged strip of gray sky through which the rain, when it came, would fall directly onto a rusted iron trough some careful hand had set beneath it years ago and never emptied. Along the two long walls stood stacks of timber, planks of oak and elm and pine of varying lengths. Some blackened at the ends with wet, but the greater part of them, when Helen went and rapped them with her knuckles, still sound to the sound of a good board. Behind the timber, ranked against the wall, were pallets of gray slate tied in bundles of 100 with tarred cord, and Helen counted the bundles at a glance, as she had been taught to count sacked grain on her father's barges, and found there were more than 60. Near the great river door stood a heavy wooden counter with a brass-bound weighing scale upon it, the pans tarnished green, and beneath the counter a row of low chests of dark wood with iron bands and small brass plates on their lids engraved with numbers from 1 to 7. And at the far end of the warehouse, past the counter, a plain plank stair led down into a cellar cut into the stone of the plinth. Helen took a stub of candle from her pocket and lit it with a match from the little tin box in which she kept her matches, and she walked the length of the warehouse slowly, counting her paces, and she found it was 22 of her paces long and 8 paces across, and she noted the 2 windows and the ventilator in the gable and the neat racks of tools hung on wooden pegs along the north wall. A plane, 3 saws of graduated size, a mallet, a set of augers, a spirit level, a plumb line, a marking gauge, a mortise chisel, a broad axe, and a set of scales for weighing small hardware. She noted a small cast-iron stove in the corner near the counter with its pipe still sound where it went up through the wall, and a coal scuttle beside it half full of dry coal that someone had brought in and never burnt. She walked to the great river door and looked through the crack between the leaves and saw the stone landing and the brown river running fast and full below it. And she thought that a person standing at that door could hail a barge in either direction, and that the door itself opened onto the water at a height that would take a plank from a barge deck without any drop at all. She came back through the dust to the ranked chests beneath the counter, and she set her candle upon the counter and knelt down before the first chest, and she saw that each chest had a small iron ring for a handle and a lock, and that the lock of the first chest, when she tried it, was not locked at all, but only stuck with rust and the swelling of damp wood. And she took the poker from beside the little stove and worked the lid gently until it lifted, and she held her candle over what lay within. Inside the first chest, folded flat and tied in bundles with faded red tape of the kind used by lawyers' clerks, lay papers, and Helen lifted them out one bundle at a time onto the counter above her and untied each in turn and read them by the light of the candle in the cold dim of the warehouse, while the afternoon went on outside and the light through the high windows shifted and thinned. There were bills of lading going back 20 years, invoices for timber delivered up the river to yards she knew by name, receipts for warehousing and for drayage and for the ferrying of slate down from the northern quarries, letters from customers in a dozen hands, a bundle of the late Josiah Meridew's private correspondence tied with a black ribbon that she set aside unread, and beneath all of these, at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of oiled sailcloth against the damp, a thick folded document of parchment sealed with 3 wax seals of green and red. Helen lifted the parchment out carefully with both hands and laid it on the counter beneath her candle and unfolded it slowly, and she read it through once in silence, and then she read it through a second time with her finger on the words, and then she sat down on an upturned crate by the counter and read it through a third time. It was the original deed of the warehouse and its appurtenances at Mill Wharf, dated the 14th day of March in the year of our Lord, 1791, drawn between one Ebenezer Meridew, timber merchant, and the ancient corporation of the Wharf under the terms of the parish charter, and it recited in the plain, heavy, Latin-inflected English of that century that the said warehouse was conveyed together with all the wharf rights, moorings, landings, weighing dues, and warehousing dues of the said Mill Wharf, and that the said rights should pass with the said warehouse to any lawful purchaser thereof, for so long as the parish charter should stand, and that no separate conveyance of the said wharf rights should be made apart from the said warehouse without the express consent of the parish vestry sealed thereto. Helen laid the deed flat on the counter and pressed the creases from it gently with the flat of her hand, and she thought of the printed bill she had read at the market cross in the rain, and of the small clause in the auctioneer's terms about the ancient wharf charter, and of the sentences she had copied into her little notebook in the vestry of St. Anne's by candlelight the night before. And she understood, quietly, sitting on the upturned crate in the cold warehouse, that the wharf rights of Mill Wharf had passed to her that morning under the auctioneer's hammer for £3, 10 shillings, and that no one at the auction, including the solicitor's clerk who had smirked at her, had known it. In the second chest, beneath more bills, she found a small canvas bag tied at the neck with tarred twine, and when she loosened the twine and turned the bag out onto the counter, 21 gold sovereigns rolled out in a soft, heavy tumble, and with them a folded paper written in a careful old woman's hand, addressed in ink across the folded outside to whoever may find this. And Helen laid the paper down beside the deed and the sovereigns and the tin box in her pocket, and she did not open it yet, but she sat still for a long time with her hands flat upon the counter, and she listened to the river running past the great door. When at last she rose from the counter, she folded the deed carefully back into its oiled sailcloth, wrapped the 21 sovereigns in her handkerchief, placed both together with the unopened letter into the deep inner pocket of her cloak beside the tin box, took up the iron key and the folded receipt with the parish seal upon it, blew out the candle, closed the warehouse door behind her, and walked back through the failing light to the Blue Heron with a step that was neither hurried nor slow. That night, at the small deal table in her room, by the light of a tallow candle Mr. Peter Hallstock had sent up without asking, Helen opened Mrs. Redwing's 4 small account books, took a fresh sheet of paper, and by copperplate and careful ruled lines began the first ledger of Tanner's Wharf. She entered on the credit side the warehouse, the timber and slate as she had counted it, the tools upon their pegs, the weighing scale, the cast-iron stove, the coal in the scuttle, the 22 pallets of oak, elm, and pine, the 60 and more bundles of slate, and the 21 sovereigns from the second chest, and on the debit side the £3.10 she had paid at the hammer, her 4 pence a night with breakfast, and a small sum set aside for what she called in the margin proving the claim. Then she wrote in a clean hand a plain letter to the vestry clerk of St. Anne's, requesting an appointment for the following morning to lodge a deed and to seek the vestry's acknowledgment of a matter arising from the auction of the 10th. She signed it Helen Tanner, sealed it with a wafer from the landlord's counter, and gave it to Mr. Hallstock to be walked to the vicarage before 8. In the morning she went at the appointed hour to the vestry, where the Reverend Mr. Ambrose Whitten and Mr. Simeon Marchbanks, vestry clerk, 57 years old, a childless widower who had kept the parish books for 19 years and who knew the ancient charter as he knew his own hand, received her at the same reading desk where she had sat 2 nights before. Helen laid before them the parchment of 1791, the auctioneer's receipt stamped with the parish seal, and her own copied clauses from the parish roll, and she asked only that the deed be entered upon the roll and the wharf rights acknowledged in her name. Mr. Marchbanks read the deed twice, laid his spectacles down, looked at Helen for a long moment, and said in a low voice that the papers were in order and that the vestry would meet upon the matter that afternoon at 4. At 4 o'clock the vestry sat, 7 men in dark coats around the long oak table, and after 20 minutes of quiet reading and 1 short question about the seals, the deed was entered upon the roll in the vestry clerk's hand, and the wharf rights of Mill Wharf were acknowledged to belong to Helen Tanner of the Blue Heron, spinster, by lawful purchase under the auctioneer's hammer of the 10th of October. Mr. Marchbanks folded a certified copy, stamped it with the parish seal, and handed it to her across the table without smiling, but with a slight bow of the head that was, in Mill Wharf, the equivalent of a spoken oath. Word of the entry traveled the parish before evening. By the following noon, Mr. Ralph Bickersteth, solicitor's clerk, had walked twice past the warehouse in a hurry, and once stood at its landward door without knocking, and by the following evening the man in the green coat who had laughed at the auction, one Mr. Jonas Peartree, timber factor, 41 years old, had sent Helen a note requesting the courtesy of a short interview at her earliest convenience. Helen answered, no notes for 3 days. She spent those days at the wharf from first light until dusk, in her plain wool dress and apron, with her hair tied in a plain knot beneath a linen cap, working through the warehouse with a broom, a bucket, a stiff brush, a pot of hot lye, and a pail of whitewash bought from Mr. Hallstock at cost. She swept the pine boards clean of 20 years of chaff and coal dust, scrubbed the counter, greased the hinges of both doors with a lump of mutton tallow, oiled the rusted lock of the landward door, and hung the heavy key on a nail behind the counter, emptied the iron trough beneath the sagging roof, and set a tarpaulin over the worst of the slipped slates while she considered the matter of the roof. On the second day, she opened the remaining chests one by one and sorted their papers into piles upon the counter. Bills paid, bills owing, correspondence, receipts, and old warrants, and she laid the 20 years of Merridew's trade into an order that told her within a single afternoon what dues the wharf had drawn in its last full year, what barges had used it, what timber yards up the river had depended on its landing, and what the neighboring quarrymasters had paid for slate warehoused there. On the third day she walked into the village at 10 in the morning and called at 4 doors in succession. She called first upon Mr. Hallstock at the Blue Heron and asked whether he knew a slater who would take honest wages for honest work. Mr. Hallstock, wiping a mug, told her of Mr. Owen Barraclough, 56 years old, slater and roofer, who lived in the last cottage on the lane, and who had roofed St. Anne's south aisle in his younger days. She called next upon Mr. Barraclough, who came to the wharf that afternoon with a leather satchel of tools, walked the roof from beneath with a lantern, sounded the trusses with his knuckles, and told her the frame was sound, and that 30 pounds of new slate and 2 days' work would set the roof right for 20 years. Helen agreed to his terms and paid him 5 sovereigns in advance from the canvas bag, and Mr. Barraclough, who had not been paid in advance for a piece of work in 11 years, took off his cap to her at the great door. She called then upon Mrs. Ada Pennyfield, 48 years old, widow, who kept a small carting business of 2 horses and a flat wagon from a yard behind the smithy, and engaged her to fetch slate from the quarry road at 3d the hundredweight, and Mrs. Pennyfield, who had known Helen's father by his flags on the river, shook her hand across the yard gate without a word. She called last upon Mr. Thaddeus Ripon, 33 years old, a lame carpenter who had lost the full use of his right foot in a fall from a scaffold and who worked from a small shop by the cooper's yard, and engaged him to plank over the soft floor near the river end and to hang a new, smaller wicket within the great river door for the passing of persons when a barge was not alongside. Mr. Ripon came the next morning with his tools in a canvas roll and his crutch under his arm. Within the week the warehouse had a sound roof of tight new slate laid over the old battens where they held, and new battens where they did not, a firm dry floor of fresh pine boards pegged and tarred at the joins, a wicket door that opened and closed without a groan, and a whitewashed interior that took the gray light of the windows and gave it back doubled. Helen wrote every payment into the ledger the same evening it was made, in the copperplate hand, Mrs. Redwing had taught her, and she paid every man and woman in coin at the end of each day's work, and she gave each of them, upon completion, a plain written receipt, signed in her hand, and stamped with a small oval seal she had bought from a stationer in the town 2 miles up the road, which read simply, Tanner's Wharf, Mill Wharf Parish. On the 8th day she opened the great river door at 8 in the morning, hung out on the landward gable a plain painted board that Mr. Ripon had cut and lettered for her at cost, reading Tanner's Wharf. warehousing, landing, and weighing dues by the ancient charter, and she sat down at the counter with her ledger open and her weighing scale polished and waited to see who would come. The first barge to tie at the stone landing of Tanner's Wharf that morning was the Prosper of Combe Regis, laden with 70 quarters of oats for a merchant in the town, captained by Mr. William Halyard, 61, who had known Helen's father across 20 years of the river and who had heard within a day of the vestry's entry upon the roll. He came up the stone steps in his tarred coat, touched his cap to Helen at the counter, paid his mooring and weighing dues in shillings without a murmur, took his receipt, and told her as he tied his purse that he would send word up and down the river that Tanner's Wharf was open under an honest hand. Behind the Prosper by noon came a second barge with slate for the roofers of the town, and by dusk a third with tallow and salt, and by the end of that first week Helen had entered into her ledger the names of 11 barges, the tonnage of their cargoes, the dues received in pounds, shillings, and pence, and the small credits given for regular custom. Mr. Jonas Peartree, timber factor, called upon her on the Tuesday of the second week, hat in hand, and asked whether he might warehouse a consignment of oak planks at her wharf against the winter trade, and Helen, without any change in her face, quoted him the standing rate of the charter and offered him no discount, and he paid it, and she gave him a receipt, and he did not laugh at her again. Mr. Ralph Bickersteth, solicitor's clerk, called upon her on the Thursday of the same week on behalf of his master, a Mr. Enderby of the town, offering to purchase the wharf rights from her at a sum which was not small, and Helen, without rising from her stool, replied that the wharf rights were not for sale and could not, under the charter, be conveyed apart from the warehouse in any case, and that she wished Mr. Enderby a good morning. Mr. Bickersteth left without smirking. Word traveled the parish. On Sundays, Helen sat now in a pew halfway forward at St. Anne's, in a plain dark dress with a clean white collar, and the Reverend Mr. Whitton nodded to her at the door as to any householder in his parish, and Mr. Marchbanks, the vestry clerk, stopped her once in the churchyard to say that the roll had been fair copied in her name, and that she might see it at any hour she wished. She was invited, in the second month, to sit upon the parish committee for the repair of the towpath bridge, being the holder of the wharf, and she accepted, and she spoke twice at the meeting, briefly, on matters of drayage and drainage, and her opinions were written into the minutes by Mr. Marchbanks without comment or query. She took a small set of rooms above the wharf clerk's office at the end of November, 3 rooms in local stone with leaded glass and a small iron grate, at 8 shillings a week from the parish, being a tenant of the vestry by her own right, and she moved from the Blue Heron with her trunk and her ledgers and her tin box on a grey morning with Mrs. Pennyfield's wagon, and Mr. Hallstock at the door of the Blue Heron shook her hand with his good hand, and said only, "Good luck to you, Miss Tanner," and Helen thanked him and paid her final reckoning, and did not look back. In the small front room above the wharf office, she set a table by the window that looked down upon the stone landing, a plain armchair, a shelf for Mrs. Redwing's 4 account books tied still in their black ribbon, a rack for her own growing ledgers, and upon the mantel above the iron grate, the japanned tin box with the faded roses, and beside it, in a small carved box she had bought for 6pence at a fair, the folded paper from the second chest, still unopened, waiting for an evening when she could sit down to it with the fire lit and the day's ledger closed. Small rituals began to form. Each morning at 7:30 she opened the great river door, hung out the board, and set the weighing scale ready. Each evening at dusk she closed the door, banked the stove, entered the day's takings in the ledger, and locked the counter. On Saturdays at noon she paid Mr. Barraclough and Mr. Rippon and Mrs. Pennyfield their small standing retainers for maintenance and cartage, and drank a cup of tea with Mrs. Pennyfield at the yard gate. On Sunday mornings she walked to St. Anne's and back. The parish, which had laughed at her on a wet October morning at £3.10, now called her, in speech and in writing, Miss Tanner of the Wharf. On an evening in late January, with the river running black beyond the leaded glass and a small coal fire burning steadily in the iron grate, Helen sat in the plain armchair, with the day's ledger closed on the table beside her, and took down from the mantel the small carved sixpenny box. She lifted out the folded paper addressed in the careful old woman's hand, "To whoever may find this," broke the wafer, and read it slowly by the fire. The writer named herself Miss Honoria Merridew, spinster, sister to Ebenezer, who had kept the Wharf books for 40 years and had lived above the counter in a small chamber long since taken down, and who had set aside 21 sovereigns from her own quarterly annuities against the day the warehouse might pass to a stranger who would need a beginning, and who wrote that she hoped whoever found the bag would read the deed with care. For the deed was the whole of the matter, and that she wished that person, whoever they might be, a long fair trade upon the river and a quiet fire at the end of the day. Helen read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it upon the mantel beside the Japan tin box with the faded roses, so that the two small papers rested together. Mrs. Redwing's note about reading a paper before signing it, and Miss Meridew's note about the deed being the whole of the matter. Two women she had never met in one case and had loved in the other, each having set down in plain ink what she knew, for the use of a girl neither had ever seen grown. Helen sat a long time with her hands quiet in her lap, and thought of her father's tally books, and the brass river token pierced for a ribbon, and of the man in the green coat at the auction, and the solicitor's clerk who had asked twice how to spell her name, and of Mrs. Redwing dying quietly in her chair with her spectacles folded, and of the vestry clerk copying her name onto the parish roll in a clean hand. Helen Tanner was 21 years old, and she had been turned out of one small life into no life at all, with 4 sovereigns in the lining of a trunk and a tin box of keepsakes and no roof of her own, and she had spent £3 10 at a river auction on a rotting warehouse of timber and slate that the parish had thought worth less than the mud beneath it. It was the best £3 10 she ever spent. If this story has warmed you at your own fire tonight, please subscribe and share it with someone who has been laughed at for seeing worth where others saw only ruin. And before you go, sit a moment with this question. What small, overlooked thing in your own life, a paper, a skill, a patient habit taught by someone who loved you, might, if read carefully and carried quietly, turn out to be the whole of the matter? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're listening from tonight.